I am going to introduce the next panel. We're actually going to switch from talking about the UK to talking about America. And we've got some businesses joining us on stage who have begun to launch their businesses into America, and others that are looking to do so. So there'll be a short video, but if the panelists could join me on stage now, that would be great. Thank you. I'd like to welcome to the stage Nick, Toddington, Gurjeet and Marc. Again, I'm going to ask them to do their own intros in just a few minutes. But before we kick the panel off properly, Marc from EY is going to just take the podium and present some slides to us.
I'm still seeing sad faces, perhaps a little bit depressed, frustrated. But the good news is there's 2 EV summits this year. We're obviously here today in Oxford. And for those of you that were here last year, I announced that we're bringing the EV Summit to America. So in October this year, we have the EV Summit US edition, where EY will be the headline partner for this great event, spearheading US businesses, North America and Europe on our EV agenda. So I'm going to spend, in true consultant style, 75 slides in 4 minutes, 12 seconds, just to open the segment of our panel today. So really want to build on some of the things that have been said already this morning. We've not even been here 2 hours. And when we look at the news, the headlines, we've got a lot to be positive about. You know, if we look at last year, it was a record year globally for EV car sales. We're seeing huge amounts of traction in all of our global markets around EV purchases. You know, when we look at, and we've mentioned this today, you know, especially in North America, where historically they've been a bit slower to the party, let's say. But when we look at the more established markets, we're already in this mainstream agenda. You know, we've seen China leap ahead. We've seen Europe, you know, really accelerate. The UK, Norway is on track to be 100% electric in the next couple of years. But the US is catching up fast. Only in the last 12 months, US car sales for EVs have jumped by 50%. And when we look at this graph in particular, the gap to close is still quite large. But as I say to everybody, Europe has had 10 years to get to this point. The US is anticipated to be at the same place that Europe is today in the next 2 years. And when we look at the US car sales in particular, you know, over the last 3 years, there's been a massive jump. And our good friends from Auto Trader mentioned this morning around 36% of people say that their next next purchase will be EVs. That is 50% in North America. 50% of all consumers that we survey suggest that their next vehicle purchase will be electric. And, you know, they're on track, you know, to by 2030, you know, to be at that tipping point, crossover point between ICE vehicles. Obviously, the US is very different. And when you look at these numbers at a state level, you see every state has recorded, apart from California, ironically, an increase in EV sales last year. But there's still a problem, and we've addressed some of this already this morning. The segmentation of EVs is really, really important in the US. When we look at, you know, the small economy type vehicles, more needs to be done by the OEMs and the car manufacturers to produce vehicles in that segment to increase ownership and buyers of lower income communities. We also talked about one of the biggest barriers to EVs being charging infrastructure. In the US, we have 164,000 publicly available chargers. We anticipate that by 2030, with over 35 million vehicles on the road, we will need at least 28 million chargers. So the scale-up of infrastructure is massively important. The issues and the challenges that you see here in the UK are no different in the US. They're just 12 times bigger. But what is it that we need to do? And again, I think everyone in this room, agrees with this, says this, is a proponent of this. But we need to make this process simpler, easier, and cheaper for the consumer. We have a bunch of different actors across the value chain coming together in a very uncoordinated way. In the US, it's very different. You have municipal utilities, all of the different state legislations, etc. More needs to be done to connect that ecosystem together. And one of the things, and I'm glad that our friends at Auto Trader and some of the other panels mentioned, is the accessibility to data is going to be key. Sharing that data amongst utilities, charge point operators, the OEMs, the connected car, the real estate organizations is going to be imperative. We're already seeing an ecosystem that we've lived and breathed for the last 100 years now changing significantly. And what people in the US want to see is when they plug in, it works, and they have confidence. So when we bring this ecosystem together, it's going to be very important that the data across these elements are accessible across that ecosystem. We're seeing lots and lots of businesses now transition into the US market, and what we want to do is be able to encourage the confidence for consumers to purchase electric. And as I've said, we see the three kind of key areas here around having that better customer experience. Everyone wants it to be seamless for sure. Faster charging and response times. In the US, part of the biggest barriers around deploying infrastructure, despite the $7.5 billion that's been allocated for that, is that the standards are a lot higher. If you install infrastructure in the US, you have to guarantee 97% reliability. They need to be 150 kW minimum, especially around the highways. There's issues around connecting into the grid. And what we need to do is, already in a constrained grid in North America, is be able to utilize renewables to put into the system to accelerate the energy that we need. And it's also important to unlock, the value that will create across many different organizations. So in conclusion, before we get into the panel and look at some of the challenges and opportunities, we see that payments and the ability to have roaming across the different states is going to be absolutely important. The standards and communications protocols, as I mentioned, the in-data between the vehicle, the chargers, the operators. I said before, 35 million EVs will be on the road in North America by 2030. That's also 35 million batteries. So when you think about the grid and how do we harness that and provide flexibility services to be able to support a grid that is already constrained, the ability to manage those connections is going to be important as well. The grid management, I think, is no secret that the US grid system is undergoing significant overhaul, digitization of that grid, increasing power, but also harnessing renewables, and smart charging as well. The ability, as we see here in the UK, to be able to use that flexibility. EV should not be a hindrance. They should be an asset and a resource. And then obviously, we need to make sure that all the right protocols around data, privacy, and cybersecurity are important. But I want to leave you with this. We are hugely excited to host the EV Summit in the US in the fall, or autumn, as we say here. I've been in the US now 4 years to set up EY's e-mobility business, and we're really, really excited to share not only the progress that we've made in North America, but more importantly, to learn and to hear from businesses in the UK and in Europe around some of the challenges, opportunities, and lessons that we can take, to really accelerate this market. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marc. Can I start with you, Nick, and just get you all just to do the quick intros?
Yeah, of course. So, great to be here. I'm Nick. I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders of EV.ENERGY. EV.ENERGY, we're a software platform that manages electric vehicle charging. We deliver smart charging. We help EVs. We turn them from liabilities to assets for grid operators. We work with about 40 different energy companies across the globe, a lot in the United States. We've been going for 6 years, and we're 120 people now.
Hi everyone, I'm Gurjeet. I'm Chief Operating Officer at OCTOPUS Electric Vehicles. In the past 4 years, we've become one of the largest specialist leasing companies for EVs in the UK, one of the fastest growing. We launched in the US earlier this year, currently operational in Texas, and we're growing at about 50% month on month at the moment.
Great. Marc Coltelli. I lead EY's America's e-mobility practice. Previously, I used to run EY's global energy business. And as I said, I moved over to the US 4 years ago to really stand up our consulting practice for e-mobility. I'm based out in New York.
Hi, everybody. I'm Toddington. I'm the founder and CEO of GRIDSERVE. We're a business on a mission to deliver sustainable energy at the speed and scale required to address the climate crisis. This is a really special event for us. It was here that we launched our concept for our first electric forecourt, Braintree. And there was quite a lot of murmurs in the audience, and people said, "Are you really going to build that?" Well, we did, and since then we've been very busy. And in fact, we've got an amazing team who work tirelessly day and night. We now have chargers across 80% of the motorway services in the UK. We're charging more than 200,000 electric vehicles every month. We're putting more than 5 gigawatt hours of energy into electric vehicles every month. And I think we've really made a massive difference in giving people confidence to make the transition, to drive where they need to in the UK, get a good experience. It's easy to charge. It may not be perfect, but it's pretty damn awesome compared to where we were. And it's down to an incredible amount of work. So we're not in the US, to be clear, but certainly because we have a mission to move the needle on climate change, and that ultimately means reducing gigawatt hours of carbon emissions, gigawatts of carbon emissions from the atmosphere, gigatons of carbon emissions, 59 gigatons by 2050, according to Speed and Scale. Then it's my job to also try and understand how we can move the needle in other territories. And so the US is absolutely fundamental. If we don't move the needle on climate change in the US, we're not going to move the needle in the world. We're not going to keep temperature rises within 1.5 degrees of warming. So part of my job, my activity, has been kind of looking into how GRIDSERVE, how do we go global? How do we use the expertise, the knowledge, the experience that we've garnered in the UK in a pretty short period of time to accelerate action and impact across the world in the US? So I've been asked to share some insight. It's certainly a market we've been looking at for a long time, and certainly a market where we think we can certainly have the ability to deliver impact. Thank you.
Thank you. Marc, I'm going to just start with you and just touch on one of the points that you made around consumer confidence in the US. Why is it you think that consumers are more confident around electric vehicles than they are in the UK, which arguably is also, as you touched on, a more mature, sophisticated market? That's really interesting to me.
I think there's a few things. Firstly, we touched upon this earlier this morning. The car buying process is an important step in that. So when you go to buy a vehicle, and especially EV, the education of owning an EV is super important. And in the US, and I've been there 4 years, the car buying process is very, very different to the UK. So, in the US, the car dealers just want to churn out, the vehicles. So spending time with the customer, telling them about all the different options, what chargers they can have at home. The reality is they don't want to do that. You know, the reality is their role is to sell cars. So what we've seen in the US in particular is this partnership ecosystem being created between all of those different industries. So utilities, charge point operators, car dealers. So when you go to a car dealer to buy an EV, you know, you may be handed off to different parts of that value chain, but it's all interconnected. You know, so you go to buy your new EV, you want to know what options you have in terms of chargers, what state and federal rebates you can get, potentially smart charging. All of that is integrated in that car buying process. And I think that's one of the fundamental things that we're doing at EY is how do we bring those partnerships together? Because what is clear is that there's lots of overlap between the different various industries. And now is the opportunity to capitalize the strengths of those industries and bring them together.
Yeah, interesting. So it certainly is, well, working together education, isn't it? And I guess, Nick, the successes that I guess we've had in the UK with some of the clean tech and you know, some of the companies like yourselves that are actually operating in the US, what learnings the US actually conversely then taking from us, from the UK?
Yeah, well, I mean, when I reflect on like the UK, I think the UK is actually in quite a leadership position in terms of tech companies that are going from the UK in clean tech and then elsewhere into other markets. And when I reflect on some of the ingredients for success, there's a few. There's the regulatory environment within the UK that's very progressive. We have a very forward-thinking regulator that's pushing out on the energy side. We have a very customer-centric approach. We may not think we do, but actually relative to quite a lot of other geographies, especially around energy and utilities, we have a very customer-centric approach. And then also possibly a leadership position in like the rollout of electric vehicles and renewable energy. And I think all of those three things really resonate when you go and talk to, say, energy companies and utilities in the United States and how they're thinking about like, well, how would I get to 100% renewable energy on my grid and then use electric vehicles as a resource to help balance the energy system on the other side? That's a really important question, as is, like, how could I deliver a electric vehicle charging service that has like NPS ratings that are better than Apple? That they want to know about that, and they want to actually use this as a tool to be able to excite and engage their customers. So I think all of those things really make for quite fertile ground for companies like ours going to the United States and then actually selling some of these key messages, which is actually a really positive story about like how we can hopefully get these electric vehicle owners involved in the energy transition and support the energy utilities to turn EVs from liabilities to assets.
Yeah. So thank you. If we think about then the companies like OCTOPUS that are going into the US, what learnings are you taking from the UK over to the US?
I'm going to massively echo the last 2 points that were made because that was effectively our thesis when we entered. The first of which is that when we started in the UK, we wanted to take a point of a niche point within the leasing sector where we could really leverage our focus on customer experience and customer love and pull everything together for drivers. We were finding that, to the point that you made, the explanation as to how to drive the car, what the features are, but then going into how you can think about how the car participates in energy systems and transition. That was not very well done here in the UK, and we found when we were going into the US exactly the same challenges, which is why we started with more of a niche and opened that up through leveraging our focus on customer experience and added in products and services, whether it's servicing, maintenance, etc., to kind of build more of a proposition for drivers and help with the end-to-end experience. And the second was actually the technology. So we're present currently in Texas, which is also by no coincidence the market that OCTOPUS started in. And by leveraging Kraken and our ability to help drivers optimize charging times and points, we can provide again a package which is more talking to drivers about how do you massively bring down total cost of ownership and optimize your charging times and costs so that actually, from our customers' perspective, they're paying, in some cases, nothing for their charging for their car. And so those 2 points were really the 2 big learnings that we started with the UK 6.5 years ago with Octopus EV. And then the last year have really been emphasizing what we're doing in the US.
Interesting. Toddington, clearly you've got a successful business in the UK. What's attracting you to America? Obviously, you've touched on clearly it's key in the climate change transition. But for you as an actual business, what are the opportunities? And obviously, doing your due diligence at the moment, what are the barriers that you're facing?
Yeah, I think there's a general perception amongst the wider public, which is what was touched on earlier, that electric vehicles are great, but charging is difficult, and that puts off people from buying vehicles. I don't think that's a reality for most people driving electric cars, certainly now in the UK. I think people think based on the surveys that it's adequate at the moment, and there's certainly a huge amount of work going on to improve it. That's in the UK. From what I understand, in the US, there are certain states that are pretty well advanced, but there's a huge swathes of the country that are just not adequate. When I first got I got my first electric car in 2014, and I would describe it as adventurous. When you were going out for a drive, and I undertook some pretty crazy journeys. The first journey that I undertook that was really crazy was driving to the south of France and back in the summer of 2014. And I was pretty confident I'd make it, but I wasn't quite sure how. And so it was adventurous. And that's okay for a certain proportion of the market, but it's not going to work for the mass market. And that's why we've pioneered projects like, Braintree Electric Forecourt, Norwich, Gatwick, and, building superchargers with, initially 6 sounded a lot. We now have sites with 24 350 kilowatt chargers capable of 100 miles of charge in 5 minutes. And I would say that's a lot less adventurous. And the scale of the UK market, the US market, as I've said, is just enormous. If we're really going to genuinely address the climate crisis, if we're actually going to be the ones, the change makers that actually people look back in history and say, these guys, you had the chance to do it. Did you do it? It will be, the answer to that will be whether or not we were the ones that implemented impact and changes that reduced gigatons of carbon emissions in the earliest timeframes. And as I said, the US is such an enormous opportunity, has such an enormous opportunity to do that. There's vast swathes of which are under-provisioned. There's huge roads, there's a massive driving culture, as opposed to, here we've got some pretty good public transport. You don't have a lot of that in the US. The other thing that we're also doing is building a network for trucks, so there's an incredible opportunity for trucks. We think that a truck does, certainly in the UK, the equivalent mileage to around 60 plus cars a year. And so really the scale of the opportunity, the kind of relative maturity of the market, and the impact that we can deliver, together with a really quite complicated grid. So, I once went to Japan about 20 years ago, and I was trying to navigate a Japanese tube map. I don't know if any of you have done that. Certainly 20 years ago, it was extraordinary. In the UK, it's all kind of like aligned nicely, and it's in English. You didn't have any of that in Japanese, which was really quite tricky. And if you look at the map in the US of a DNO grid, or the DNO grids, it kind of looks quite similar. Lots of DNOs, some regulated, some less regulated, some grids that don't kind of work across different states. Lots and lots of complexity to unpick. And so I called the company GRIDSERVE to be part of, so we could be part of the solution to serving the grid and providing solutions. We also, and we need that in the US, so it's just not gonna work. The US, a lot of the US is pretty sunny, so we also pioneered the sun to wheel model. So again, sharing this information, that in the UK, we can generate from a solar farm, we can generate more than 1 million EV miles per year per acre of land. And so if you're somewhere in the US that's a lot sunnier, that might be 2 million miles per acre, for example. And if you can directly plug that energy in, which there is a lot of land, so that maybe that's possible, then that can make it cheaper. And I think just as a general tone, it's great to see in this summit that it feels like the focus, the next phase is kind of here, is how do we make it cheaper? Because people have been constantly sort of saying, you know, is the infrastructure going to work? How do you make it mass market? I think that we're making great strides. There's incredible work going on. You know, it's great to be part of Charge UK. What a great association. That didn't exist either. And you know, there's huge amounts of work going on, so people do have that confidence. So the next level is how do we, you know, encourage uptake? And I think the integration of renewable energy, making it easier, making it cheaper, is certainly where to go. And I think the US is just an incredible opportunity to do that.
Marc, related point, a pitch for America, if you will. You've outlined the growth opportunities, and obviously we've talked through some of the barriers, but you know, if there's anyone here thinking, you know, maybe, is it right for my business to consider America? Is there any advice that you would give them?
Well, I mean, I think, firstly, notwithstanding what might happen in November with the elections, there's a huge amount of government support right now. You know, I mentioned earlier, 7.5 billion has been allocated to the infrastructure build out. And whilst we're here talking about EVs and e-mobility, it's not just about EVs, it's about decarbonisation overall. So, you know, touching on some of the points, you know, we have a massive opportunity and obligation, you know, to really drive decarbonisation at a global scale. And the US, you know, is at the forefront of that in terms of, you know, really reducing reliance on fossil fuels, you know, increasing, you know, solar, you know, bringing that flexibility into the grid. Because, you know, I think as everyone has touched upon, you know, consumers right now, whether it's about range anxiety, whether it's about, you know, accessible infrastructure, people just want confidence, you know, so they don't want a grid that when they plug in, it doesn't work. They don't want a, you know, charger that they have to spend 25 minutes downloading an app, putting all their details in. They just want simplicity. And I think if we can really address at the heart of this, ultimately is the consumer, and then around it, you know, really build out the things that we need to do to make, you know, the reality that Toddington made around decarbonisation. The US is, and I want to give a shout out to Canada as well, because it's not just about the US, it's about North America more broadly. You know, you look at some of the progress that we've seen in Canada, Vancouver as an example, you know, they probably have the same penetration rates in terms of EVs as somewhere like California. There's a whole motion now happening in North America, underpinned, you know, by renewables and decarbonisation, and the fact that there's money to be invested there at the federal and the government level is really attractive there for businesses alike.
Gurjeet, have you had to do anything differently in America?
Not materially. I mean, the two core concepts for us are, it's not just about a car. We're not, you know, having a financing contract to get an EV on the road is a great start, but you have to do a lot more than that. So it's about leveraging the technology platforms that we both have experience of, and having interconnectedness with kind of overall the grid locally. And then again, like, providing a bundle of services where you can really show multiple opportunities to demonstrate lots of love and care for customers. Those are the two main things. I think just to answer the question on what are the things that we've been surprised by, or what have we learned when we've been there, it's definitely not one market. You know, I don't know if it's actually even 50 markets. I think it's probably more than that. So I think it's about picking your points to enter really carefully, because if you try with a homogeneous impact, I think that's really hard to do without basically spending all of your life over there. And actually, I'm not sure if it's possible if you just approach it as one market. And I think the other thing we've been surprised by is the consumer understanding about charging and how to charge and how you can charge at home. We are much further ahead in terms of standardizing charging, having kind of one charging standard, whereas in the US, they're not there yet. And I think consumer understanding about how to plug your car in at home and charge it at home is probably not where it is in Europe at the moment, and that for us was more of a surprise, I think, than we'd anticipated.
I have no idea, this is based on no days, but I did live in America for a while. I went to uni there, but most people, well, I say most people, do more people have driveways, off-street access to off-street parking in America than they do in the UK? I said obviously in the UK it's about 50-50 split, but I think just that alone, knowing that, you know, you can plug in at home should be a kind of game changer.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think if you were to look at like the major conurbations, I'm not sure it would necessarily be dramatically different, but there's just a lot more land out there. So like, you know, suburban and urban and non-urban, I think is probably much higher driveways, which would be a lot better. But those are the two big things for us to kind of really think about.
Thank you. I'm going to open it up to the audience just quickly, the last few minutes. Anyone who's got any questions? Oh, yeah, gentleman just there, thank you.
Just a general comment. Does anybody watch any of the Out of Spec YouTube channels? Kyle Connor, who drives around the United States looking at charging infrastructure. It's a fascinating watch for people wanting to enter the US. The US charging infrastructure that isn't the big T one is absolutely dire. You just see some of it. Some of it is just funny. It reminds me of me in 2017 trying to get from A to B.
Yeah, I mean, I think familiar with the channel. We've actually had a few of our clients in the US, let's say, be affected by some of those reviews. And I mean, again, it's the culture of social media and you know the ability to put online people's views, which you know sometimes cloud, and we've seen this with some of the press towards EVs, you know, cloud some of the good work that is being done. You know, but as I mentioned, you know, the standards for EV charging in the US has been set at a very high bar, right? You know, having accessible infrastructure along highway corridors, you know, I think the guys have mentioned huge amounts of land to travel and cover, you know, moving away from that range anxiety to charging confidence is the ultimate goal.
Is there another question? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Ted Rouse. I'm with Bain & Company. I moved here from the U.S., Mark. I went the opposite direction. Tons of questions for you guys, but the maybe number one, I wonder whether you have seen, I mean, this issue of a big country that's all different. I assure you it's very accurate, and we drive really long distances. The economics of putting in charging infrastructure in those remote locations. Have you seen data on this? What data I've seen is, you know, you need a certain amount of volume put through a charging station to be able to make it work.
Do you want to take that, Nick?
And to make the economics work for investors, to put in, you know, the full network that, you know, it might take, Mark, you know,
yeah,
to fill out that grid.
It's a huge issue because, you know, again, we've touched upon some of the different industries. I mean, think about agriculture, where, you know, they have fleets of vehicles going to really remote places, you know, on farms and on land where there isn't that access of infrastructure available, you know, and part of that is being offset by the funding that's available to strengthen the grid in those places. But as I mentioned at the beginning, it's about how do we use EVs as an asset rather than a hindrance, you know, so how do we use, you know, the battery capacity of EVs, and especially when you get into the big trucks and the available storage that is there to support the grid in those aspects. But, you know, I think at the moment, the focus is really increasing the availability of chargers, you know, improving the grid and digitizing the grid more importantly so that we can have that flexibility in some of the remote rural locations that you're mentioning.
Maybe I could add to that as well. So, you know, I just say fairly broadly, the charge point operator business is tough. It's a tough business, particularly if you are kind of on the sort of scale end of it that we are. You know, when you're putting in 360 now 400 kilowatt chargers that you know, are future-proofed, but are not being used anywhere near the capacity they can deliver in terms of either in power or utilization on day one. And you need to do that, and you need banks of them to give people the confidence to get the scale. It's a really tough business model. And it's all future focused, and so that's why investor confidence is really important, and seeing what people see in the newspapers just isn't very helpful. And the more that the industry can do and people can do to increase confidence, the better. But I think that's also where government support comes in, and certainly in the US, I think the Inflation Reduction Act and the support that's available is pretty unprecedented, and that's really helps to massively get over the kind of chicken and egg issue as well. But I think anywhere you're going to have issues. Some locations are absolutely phenomenal; they work really well. Some locations you're just going to struggle with. So, I think over time, the business models are going to get easier. Less support is going to be needed. But certainly, it is very encouraging in the US to see the scale of support that's available to really kind of push this forward, and plus the strategy of high power chargers on highways and so on and so forth, which from our experience is exactly what's needed to deliver the confidence.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm so sorry, that's all we've got time for now. I'm being flashed out again. I'm going to have to move things on, but again, the guys will all be around at lunch, I think. We'll be happy to chat. So just round of applause. Thank you very much. I'll ask you just to rejoin the